This week, we welcome Graeme Payne, former Senior Vice President and CIO of Global Corporate Platforms at Equifax, to discuss lessons learned from a data breach. In the Leadership and Communications section, CISO position burnout causes high churn rate. 7 rules for staying productive long-term. Now is an unprecedented opportunity to hire great talent and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. With over half of enterprise security budgets going towards detection and response in 2020, the challenge is investing in solutions that can migrate and scale with your business. ExtraHop helps security teams spot threats up to 95% faster and respond 60% more efficiently in hybrid and multi-cloud environments with cloud-native network detection and response. Kick the tires in the full product demo at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 172, recorded May 4th, 2020. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado. Joining me from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island is my co-host, Mr. Paul Asadorian. May the 4th be with,
That's right.
with you. Yes.
May the 4th. My youngest was watching the original Star Wars movie in his Darth Vader pajamas with a Darth Vader mask. It was very fitting. It's very fitting. I mean, that's just an everyday for him, but it was very fitting that it was the 4th.
Yes, it was the 4th. And on the lines joining us remotely is my second co-host, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Great to be here, Matt. Paul, may the 4th be with you.
Yes, I'll try to keep our Star Wars notes under control today, but Paul will probably try to weave it in.
That's it.
Learn how penetration testing reduces risk in our next live webcast with Core Security, a health systems company. Register for our upcoming webcast or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts. You can also access our on-demand library of previously recorded webcasts and trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. Also, join the Security Weekly mailing list by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. We will be rolling out our new public Discord channel over the next few weeks, and so our mailing list subscribers will get the first set of invites. I've been waiting for this interview segment for, about 6 months, I think, when I first got an opportunity to try to get Graeme on. Graeme Payne is a consultant, speaker, and coach. He works with boards and senior executives to help them understand and manage cybersecurity and IT risks. During the Equifax 2017 data breach, he was Senior Vice President and CIO of Global Corporate Platforms. He was fired the day before the former chairman and CEO of Equifax testified to Congress that the root cause of the data breach was a human error and technological failure. Graeme would later be identified as the human error. Graeme, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Like I said, I've been waiting for this interview for about 6 months. We got introduced by Thomas Lewis from CyberMax. We met briefly down at one of the events down in Nashville last year, and was just an honor to have you come on. I want to talk about lessons from a data breach, obviously the 2017 Equifax data breach. Before we get started into kind of the flow I want to go through today on some key topics, kind of give everybody a little bit of background of your story through the Equifax breach, just to kind of level set everyone?
Sure, absolutely. Yep. So it was I joined Equifax in 2000 and around 2008, and I was 2010. So I originally joined as the VP of IT Risk and Compliance, and I was responsible for a lot of the risk and compliance within the global IT organization. And then a couple of years after that, I moved into the CIO role, and so was there responsible for the system that was actually hacked in the 2017 data breach. So that was sort of, and then I lived through that whole. I think the breach was detected on July the 29th, 2017, which is actually my birthday, and then I was there through the remediation, the initial investigation, through to the public announcement, and then in the post notification period up until the time when I was fired on October the 2nd, the day before Rick Smith testified in Congress.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, that the kind of the conclusion was human error and technological failure. I think there's actually probably maybe a little more in there than those just two things. So I want to unpack this a little bit for the audience and kind of talk through this. We had an interview a few weeks back with Richard Allen Clark, who wrote a book about cyber resilience. And he said there are three key areas for a company to be cyber resilient. And we're going to kind of talk about them in this order because I want your take on this from what was going on at Equifax pre and kind of where the recommendations are going forward. One was governance, having a governance structure in place. One was a culture of security. And the last one was appropriate amount of spending on security. So let's start with governance. Where was security role in Equifax prior to the breach? What kind of governance model was in place?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's one of the things about the Equifax breach is it's been so widely studied and reported on through the various investigations that have been done with the congressional committees, attorney generals, privacy commissioners, and so on across the globe. So a lot of this information is out in the public domain. A lot of criticism was placed around the positioning of the security function. So when I started at Equifax, security, and right throughout my time there, security was never part of the IT organization. The global security organization reported up through the chief legal officer. And there were some historic reasons for that, primarily trying to, as they built the security program, they wanted to try and get it out of IT just because that inherent conflict that sometimes exists. So security, from a governance perspective, the security function reported through legal. Obviously, there was a lot of codependence on the IT organization, and so security officer reported. CISO reported to the chief legal officer, who was part of the senior leadership team, and then of course we had reporting, periodic reporting to the board of directors. We actually had a technology committee at the board of directors. Which is, probably a leading practice. Not a lot of companies had one back then, and so decisions were made through that sort of governance structure.
Okay, and we're going to talk about the role of the board during a breach in kind of the lessons learned section when we get later into this discussion. So you've got appropriate governance structure in place. Where is the culture of security then within Equifax prior to the breach? How pervasive was it? Where were priorities set from a security perspective?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of comments on that. So, firstly, obviously we took seriously the data that was entrusted to us. We had personal information on nearly 1 billion consumers worldwide, and hundreds of millions of small businesses. So a tremendous amount of highly sensitive and personal data. And so as data stewards, we did take that seriously. The security program had been around for a long time. It was pretty reasonably well resourced, and people understood that security was everyone's responsibility. So I think culturally throughout the organization, it wasn't as if anyone was asleep at the wheel in terms of recognizing that this was an important issue. and it was on our risk dashboards and everything. Obviously, security was up there as one of the top issues. I think translating that from sort of that culture to when we'll probably get into next, which is sort of the spend and the prioritization and actually getting things done, I think it becomes a little more challenging, because here you've got a company that was growing very quickly, a lot of acquisitions. I think we made 16 or 17 acquisitions over the 7 years that I was there, and just a tremendous amount of change going on in the organization. So the challenge was sort of migrating from a lot of legacy systems and legacy thinking to a more to a more sort of modern digital organization. So a lot of transformation going on in the systems area, and in a lot of our business processes, in the way that we were developing and building solutions. Moving from sort of traditional approaches to agile, applying a lot more software engineering principles. So all of that change was going on while the company was going through, rapid growth, a lot of acquisitions. And so the challenge, I think, is not so much that security wasn't considered important, but it was more the prioritization of the things that needed to be done, and how do you live through that and make all the investments in the right areas and continue to transform everything at the same time. That was, I think, one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. In the reason I structured the interview this way was so that we can go back and look at Richard Allen Clark's interview, and he talks about these three components. You just said, look, Equifax had a good governance model in place. Now, maybe where the CISO reported to legal, maybe should have been somewhere else, maybe to the CEO directly. And we can talk about some of that from the lessons learned. There's a good culture in place, but now it's down to investment and spend and prioritization of spend. So 2 of the 3 elements were kind of in place at Equifax prior to the breach, right?
Yes, I think so. I would agree. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Great.
I was going to say, if I could ask a question, Graeme, this is Paul. So we talk a lot on our shows about the importance of SDLC, vulnerability management, how pen testing can help identify risk. The reduction of risk doesn't come until someone actually takes an action to remediate, right? So what in your opinion, was missing that kind of led to that last final step, which every organization struggles with? I've been doing this over 20 years and pointing out these flaws and coaching in organizations, and it always comes down to someone has to actually remediate it. And that's often where folks fall down.
Oh, absolutely. And I think at the time of the breach, this is public information. There was over 10,000 open vulnerabilities, which is not uncommon in a large organization to have a large number of unremediated vulnerabilities. It's a constant battle. So I think to your point, it's the again, if people I would say by and large everyone took security seriously, and so the culture was right. But what was missed? So what, as organization, and this probably applies to many organizations, as you're going through rapid transformation and rapid change, if you're not adjusting the processes that you have relied on, maybe you tried and true processes for the last 10 years, but now there's changes, there's organizational changes, there's process changes, there's transformation going on in the technology. All of those things are constantly changing. And if you're not constantly adapting and adjusting your processes to make sure that they address the needs of that changing environment, I think that's when the gaps come. And so there were clearly gaps in communication, there were gaps in process and policy execution and so on. So we can talk more about those as we get on here. But I think that's that to me is really the big challenge.
Yeah, and that's frustrating for everyone, right? When the security is important. Everyone understands security is important, and you're going through this rapid change. So there were probably a lot of people going, I know there's stuff we need to fix, but we're undergoing all this change, and we just can't fix it fast enough, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. That's interesting. See, I had called that as there wasn't a security of culture, but you've corrected me.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm glad.
my understanding at Equifax is that the security culture was very mature. The security program was very mature. I think one of the original CISOs before Susan Malden was Tony Spinelli, right? And I think he built a pretty strong practice at Equifax, from what I understood.
That's right. I think we were one of the first to be ISO certified.
Yeah, ISO 27001.
And I think when the Equifax security program was held up for a long time as being one of the leading programs that people wanted to learn from.
Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, from your perspective, right? I mean, at my organization, we rely a lot, just from a programmatic perspective, on NIST, right? And NIST has prevention, protection, detection, response, identify and recovery. From your perspective, was there a portion of this? I know traditionally a lot of organizations will focus on prevention. Was there a gap on the detection side, or maybe the identification side, maybe knowing assets, knowing the current state of those assets, where you needed patches, things of that nature?
Oh, there's a lot in there. But so I think just thinking through the ISO, Equifax primarily used the ISO framework, but I mean, it's just a different sort of framework. But yeah, I think prevention and detection was reasonably good. There were definitely gaps, and we can talk some specifically about some of the gaps that caused this breach. But clearly, I think there was a good balance between preventive, detective controls. Response processes. Well, this was the biggest response to any sort of incident that ever happened at and ever has happened since. So there's definitely exposed some gaps there, but there were responses there that the company had invested a lot in building monitoring capabilities, not necessarily to where they needed to be, but there was a SOC and significant amount of investment going on into putting in the monitoring capabilities. So again, I think from a sort of if you think of it from a NIST framework, I think all of those things were there, but there were I think the challenge, and I think this is a challenge for all large organizations, is as you're going through rapid change, and you just think about the environment we're in now. I mean, all this change and all this complexity that you bring to bear, just maintaining some of these basic processes and procedures and adapting them for changing circumstances. It's an ongoing challenge. I think every risk and security person has to, constantly focus on.
Yeah, definitely. And Jason and Paul, you both touched on aspects of some of the lessons learned, I think, from the Equifax breach. So Graeme, let's get into some of those, right? Like, what was number one on the list? What was the kind of the big thing that you recognized wasn't being done well that led to the breach?
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of things. I don't know if it depends on what time frame, because every if you break it up, there was certainly some aha moments along the way. But I think initially that if you sort of break it down to what was the fundamental in my view, the fundamental underlying causes, I think, of this specific breach, I think one of the big gaps was in the patch management process, clearly. So information did not get to the administrators responsible for patching the Apache Struts vulnerability in this particular system. And why did that happen? Well, the process wasn't very robust in terms of getting the information to the people that needed to get that information. There wasn't a good sort of feedback loop. After every critical patch was installed, there was supposed to be a security scan performed on the systems to ensure that those issues had been remediated. Well, that scan was done, but it didn't show any issues, any unremediated vulnerabilities. And I think the third big area was the reason why we didn't detect the breach earlier was because there was a digital certificate on an IDS or IDS IPS system that was sitting on the network that hadn't been updated for over 10 months. So there was no visibility into what was going on. So, if you combine those three things at sort of a basic level, I think, fundamentally they are the underlying causes of the breach. But then there's, but then you go on and say, well, there was lessons learned in the response process, there was lessons learned in remediation, and so on. We could talk some more about that. But fundamentally, that was, to me, were the three sort of underlying causes of why this breach occurred.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, for me, the incident response process is very interesting to hear stories about, because honestly, the Equifax breach was unprecedented, right? I mean, it's something that was net new territory, at least for us as U.S. citizens, and I think lessons learned there from a people, process, and a technology perspective, right? I mean, I look at from a people side of the aisle. How did you bring resources together internally and through partners, right? Because I'm assuming you had to engage attorneys, incident response companies, cyber insurance. What's the process around that? And then technology, right? At the end of the day, communication and notifications, and then signing people up for the services, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm sure you had to bolster up technology just to get folks signed up for the services coming out of this.
Absolutely. So let me comment. I can comment on all those. I mean, just trying to work out the impact of what had happened initially. So as I said, July the 29th, I got a call from the chief security officer saying, we've identified this issue, and the issue was discovered because we installed updated those digital certificates. So we immediately had visibility into that traffic, and we're able to see that there was some suspicious activity going on. So then when you kick into the incident response process, well, first thing you got to do is try and understand what's going on. And, it was pretty clear within a couple of days that we'd probably had a PII, a personally identifiable information breach, but, how extensive? We had to recreate the attack. And so absolutely, we brought forensics capabilities in. And it took them several weeks just to get access to the data to start their testing, and parallel with that, there was a whole we then started. We got to a point where we realized, well, this was actually a pretty significant breach. So we needed to then work out, well, what type of response are we going to give to consumers, impacted consumers? And Equifax is in this unique situation where the data they held wasn't their customers. A lot of companies that are breached, they can communicate directly with their customers because they know who their customers are. Well, the data that Equifax holds is consumer information. Consumers aren't necessarily their customers. They primarily deal in the customer data, but they deal in it with other businesses. So what do you do? What do you do for the consumers? And we had a small consumer division, but there was no way that it could handle enrolling, tens of millions, but what eventually became hundreds of millions of people into their services. So we had to come up with a unique solution there. And so we went to the cloud, and we built a portal to basically give the ability for people to A, determine whether they were impacted, and B, to sign up for services. And then all of this and then there was a tremendous amount of hardening that needed to be done in preparation for the public announcement. And that in itself was an amazing experience, because there was a relatively small number of us in a war room over a space of about 6 weeks. And we brought a bunch of consultants in, but it was highly it was sort of a code of silence. It was highly secretive because we didn't want to get this information leaking out. And so a relatively small number of people did a tremendous amount of work in a relatively short amount of time under a sort of cloak of silence. And so it was an incredible effort on all accounts, I believe, and probably the most intensive 6 week of my 30-year career.
Yeah, amazing when you think about it, because you're trying to get everything ready so that you can support the rest of the activities. Let's talk a little bit about the roles, the board's role in the incident response process. You and I talked about this a little bit. The board played a very interesting role in this response, and I want people to kind of understand some of the good and maybe bad that came out of that participation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we had, as I said, we had a technology committee of the board. We had, an audit committee, all the standard groups, and we regularly updated them on what was going on from a security and and risk program. What we didn't anticipate, I think, was the role the board was going to play in helping to manage the response. So the board, we didn't actually notify the board till August the 24th, 25th, and we went public on September the 7th. So there wasn't a lot of time, but they immediately started meeting. They formed a special committee because they immediately started meeting on on the response, the initial announcements that we're going to make, and I think on a daily basis they were meeting and helping with that. And then once it went public, then they would continue to meet on a regular basis and started to form some special committee. There was the allegation that executives had sold stock, and so they had to form a special committee to look at that issue. They were very engaged in the, as you may remember, in the post notification period, because we had issues with people being able to get into call centers. We had issues with the website. We had a lot of public outcry, and so the board was very engaged in helping to formulate how we should respond to these things. And then as we started to put our action plans in place to address some of those issues, they wanted regular updates. I mean, daily, every second day, we were providing metrics on our call center volumes and things like that to the board. So it was an interesting process. I mean, I think they were way more engaged than we had anticipated. And since then, I know that they've established some pretty interesting protocols about how they want to be advised of cybersecurity breaches, what the escalation process is, and what their role is. And that's one of the key recommendations I make to to boards and executives that I work with is, practice, define those roles now when you're not in a sort of distress situation, and practice them. So I'm at least once a year, take your board of directors through a drill or simulation of a tabletop exercise of a breach, and make sure that it's clear what information they want, what they need to know, what role they're going to play, and define and get all that defined and sort of the protocols established now.
Yeah, the how you should communicate is so important, right? Because you can say, well, person A should tell group B or whatever, but how is that communication flowing? In an incident response, is that system up and running, and what's the backup?
Yeah. And we had we had right through that, and then we had the chief executive and the chairman of the board retire. So then you're looking for you've got a then you've got a CEO search that's going on. There's just there's a lot of dynamics going on, and then investigations. I mean, every state virtually announced investigations against the company. You had the several congressional committees, both the Senate and the House, demand hearings, and then there were then on the international scene there were also various investigations launched, and so there's probably 50 or 60 investigations launched into the incident from regulatory bodies, and so dealing with that is a challenge because they're all sending in demands for documents, and it was a tremendous amount of disruption to the business in that post notification period.
And at the end of the day, I'm sure the media didn't help, right? I mean, I'm sure they were peppering you as well, looking for information. A lot of noise out there. I mean, I specifically remember a big deal about the CISO having a degree in music, and for me, that's noise, right? I mean, it's noise, and I'm sure that created a lot of issues as well.
Absolutely, and I thought it was very unfair, unfortunately, for Susan to have to experience that, because she had a long history in security, and I thought it was unwarranted. But it becomes very personal. That situation. I mean, for me, I was terminated on October 2nd. I think October the 4th, I got a call from the Equifax HR people to say basically that they were concerned about my personal safety because there had been a leak to the media about the fact that I was no longer with the company, and they were and some of the other executives had received death threats, and so they wanted to and they did give me a personal security detail for a week or so for my family and I. So it becomes really personal, really personally impacting when you have a security detail. assigned to you.
That's terrible. I mean, to say nerve-wracking before that happened was probably the case, and I'm sure very much so after that. Graeme, I just want to ask you about the recommendations you have for communication improvement between the various IT and security groups and development. Like you have some great insight as to what was missing. I'd love to hear what your recommendations are, because this is such an important point, I think, for securing an organization, are those communication points.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I've never been, I've never sort of, throughout the years, I have never really felt strongly about where security should report, whether it should be part of IT or somewhere else. And I think a lot of that depends on the culture of the organization, the people involved, the overall governance models. There's a lot of variables that go into that. But regardless, whether it's in IT or outside of IT, the communication is so critical. And for me, what's one of the biggest roles of a CISO is being able to articulate risk and in business terms, to be able to talk to executives and build the relationships across the organization and explain and be able to whether you're talking to the head of operations, the head of sales, or the head of IT, be able to talk in terms that is relevant to them about what are the risks, what are the concerns, what needs to be done, what role you want them to play to help you advance your program, and be able to articulate that as a skill. And unfortunately, in my observation, generally a lot of people that have come up through a technical through the sort of technical path in security, they're challenged with those skills. And they can be learned. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And there's some great communicators out there. So it's not like it's an impossible barrier, but it's a barrier. And people, as soon as you move up through into more and more leadership roles, I think it's really important to recognize that you've got to be able to be a good communicator. You've got to be able to build relationships across the organization. And you've got to be able to put things in the terms that people can understand and relate to their world.
All the things we try to focus on in this podcast, leadership, communication, and help the security community be able to hopefully improve those skills.
Right.
Jason, Paul, any additional questions for Graeme while we have him?
No, I'm good to go. This was awesome. Thanks, Graeme.
Were there technical people with like their hair on fire before this event, like kind of a premonition of, I don't have access to and have this visibility, there's a vulnerable Strut server running? Like I'm sure there was there some of that happening?
Yeah, I mean, there were known risks and gaps, some of which weren't necessarily the cause of this particular breach, but and wasn't the first breach that Equifax had either. I mean, there'd been other breaches in the past, so the company was obviously a huge target for hackers just because of the personal information that's both whether criminal hackers as well as nation state actors, because it has a tremendous amount of data. And so, being able to, repel those attacks when if someone got through, being able to sort of quickly close it down and respond to it, which I think we did on several occasions prior to this, was important. But this really emphasizes the fact that it's one particular place. This Apache Struts vulnerability was just one of tens of thousands of vulnerabilities that were I think 16,000 vulnerabilities were issued by CERT in 2017. So this is just one of 16,000 things that could have gone wrong, right? And for 99% of the time, you're able to find the right assets, install the patches or reconfigure the systems, have the intrusion detection and response processes, well established and so on. But it just takes one situation like this where, the patch didn't get to the right people, the information to the patch didn't get to the right people, we weren't able to, the security tools that we ran weren't able to detect that the system was, we didn't have the intrusion detection system, digital certificates in place. So we were flying blind for several months. And then, the combination of all those things, you have a breach. And then, unfortunately, because there were other things like lack of segmentation, some poor password practices that were pointed out. So, that also increased the attack surface, if you like, of what the hackers were able to get access to. And lack of encryption, and the story just becomes a sort of goes on, and then the response process and some. So it's but 90-odd%, 99% probably of every other time we were able to either stop them before they got in, or once they got in, we're able to quickly detect them and react. But just took one time, and I think that's that's a tremendous challenge for people in the security field to be able to manage that. We have to be right 100% of the time. That the attackers only have to be right one time, right?
Yeah, we have to be right 100% of the time in all the right areas.
Right.
That's the tricky part.
Yeah, that one gap with this one gap with this one gap all come together at the same time, and here we are.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Graeme, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thanks so much, Graeme.
You're welcome.
And with that, we'll take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.